Thank you for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Is it time to turn off the stimulus taps from Ottawa? Our guests think so, and they'll explain why and what's next. Let's hear from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute think tank. Aaron Wudrick is the director of MLI's Domestic Policy Program, and Philip Cross is a senior fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Welcome, gentlemen. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having us, Tony.
Maybe start with you, Philip. Tell us why that you think that further stimulus is not necessary.
Well, the economy has effectuated almost a complete recovery back to its pre-pandemic levels. The only sectors that are lagging at this point really are the ones providing person-to-person services, and they have particular problems that need specific solutions. But the broader economy has completely recovered. In fact, the biggest concern for the economy today is inflation, and pouring more demand into a supply-constrained economy is a recipe to create more inflation.
Aaron Wudrick, do you agree with Philip's analysis there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think inflation is the biggest risk. And I mean, there's a couple of other problems with all the spending. One is just fiscally. I mean, this government has consistently overshot the mark when attempting to provide support for Canadians. All the evidence shows that they have overcompensated people. So a lot of people are throwing money in the bank. They have a higher savings rate. They're using that to, for example, buy houses. That is creating other problems in real estate. And also in terms of incentives, a lot of the supports that were necessary maybe in March 2020, if they're continuing now, we're seeing a lot of employers having a hard time finding people who want to come back to work because there are a lot of people who are happy to take the benefits and stay home. And so I think the government has a problem here rather than sort of recalibrating their support to make sure that the money is going, there's certain sectors like tourism, which are still hurting. But as Philip said, most of the rest of the economy has recovered and the government should be sort of paring back its supports to reflect that.
Yeah, a couple of different things that we need to talk about after that initial conversation we've just had. First of all, inflation. The latest numbers for July were an inflation rate of 3.7%, and the basket of goods that represents that, 6 out of the 8 were in inflationary mode. Philip Cross, are you concerned about that?
Yes, and a bigger concern is, I hate to say it, but I think it's likely that Stacan has understated the amount of inflation. This is a really difficult time for Statistics Canada to be measuring inflation. Normally, just going out and surveying and taking prices does the job. But in this instance, what you have to take account of is the decline in quality, and in particular, the decline in service, that we have to wait an extra long time everywhere we go, and partly because, as Aaron mentioned, of the labor shortages. And that decline in quality is de facto a price increase. And there's really no way for Statistics Canada to incorporate that into its measures. So it's quite likely that the inflation rate is closer to what the Americans are seeing, which is a little bit more than 5%. So I think, 3.7% is obviously a very high rate of inflation as it is, but it's likely the actual rate of inflation is higher than that.
Yeah, Aaron, you mentioned this already, but inflation is partially being caused by the fact that there's a whole lot of money sloshing around from the government in people's bank accounts, and it's having an impact on the real estate market and supply chains and all sorts of things, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's a bread and butter issue for a lot of Canadians, right? I mean, it's one thing to talk about big ticket items like housing, but, luckily for most people, they're not in the market for a house. But for things like groceries, if prices for groceries increase, people are feeling that pinch every time they go to the grocery store. This starts to become a serious political issue that concerns a lot of Canadians.
Do you see this being part of the election campaign discussion?
I think it may be a sleeper issue. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence that cost of living generally is something that a lot of Canadians are concerned about. And inflation is obviously what is driving those concerns. So I think this may become a hotter topic as the election goes on.
Yeah, I agree. I think the broader issue of how people pay their bills and what their expectations are in terms of their ability to do so in the future, that is definitely going to be an issue in the campaign as we move forward. We're only at the point of recording just in week one, but look for that in the future. We are going to talk about the election a little bit later in this broadcast. We are going to take a short commercial break right now and get right back to these issues, so please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Aaron Wudrick. He is the director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute Domestic Policy Program. Philip Cross is with us as well. He's a senior fellow at MLI, which is, of course, a national think tank in Ottawa. Philip, gonna ask you, I'm gonna sort of pivot back to this idea of turning off the stimulus taps from Ottawa. You have something called a leading economic indicator kind of measurement. So how does that work exactly?
Well, that's designed to capture emerging trends in the economy. For example, people start building a house, that counts as a housing start. That triggers what's going to be higher expenditure over the next year or two, or even up to 5 years in the case of a big high rise. So it's designed to pick up emerging trends in the economy. It's had a trouble in this instance because the economy today is actually not being determined by economic forces, which it's designed to pick up. The economy is being controlled by arbitrary decisions of politicians. You can open today, you close tomorrow. It's almost impossible to design a system that's going to pick up that. But the indicators do pick up that once politicians have made a decision about opening or closing parts of the economy, the indicator will quickly reflect what the ripple effect of those decisions is.
So it's basically saying that, as you're saying, that growth is already happening in most parts of the economy, and that to have this additional money from Ottawa is creating deleterious impacts on the economy. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. As we enter summer, as all the provinces, especially Ontario, have lifted most of their restrictions, we're seeing across-the-board gains in the economy, which, along with the strength we're seeing in the global economy, suggests that we don't need further stimulus. The biggest problem, throughout the pandemic has been how poorly targeted the stimulus has been. I mean, right. You could say initially, perhaps in the first month or two, we didn't know what was happening, but very clearly it became obvious that it was only certain sectors of the economy that were really struggling. And we should have done a better job of focusing our aid on those particular sectors instead of giving the kind of across the board transfers and help to people that we've been doing for almost 2 years now.
Aaron Wudrick, do you agree with the analysis of Philip there? There was too much scattergun there?
Well, absolutely. And the government justifies it on the basis that early on they had to move quickly. And I think that's a good defense for what they did early on. But the reality is a lot of these programs that were poorly designed were not fixed as they went along. There's evidence that, for example, as of a couple of months ago, they'd sent $7 out the door for every dollar in lost income. That means there's just a lot of money that, people have reaped a windfall and thrown it in the bank. Same for things like the wage subsidy. The way they designed the program, it essentially subsidizes all jobs at a company rather than just the jobs that are at risk because of the pandemic. So, this has added up to tens of billions of dollars. And, the government has not really taken serious steps to tightening them up as they go along.
So, Aaron, I have to ask this question. It may seem like a dumb one to ask, but why is there still this emphasis on stimulus then?
Yeah, it beats me. I think it's mostly political. In a way, if anything, they've almost preloaded the stimulus, right? Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, has said things like, when things open up, we want to stimulate the economy. Well, guess what? You already sent $7 out the door for every dollar that Canadians lost. A lot of Canadians have just thrown that in the banks. The savings rate is up. So if you open up the economy and people want to start spending and start traveling and things like that, you've got your stimulus right there. So there's really no need for them to start talking about all these massive new plans, hundreds of billions of dollars that they want to spend for additional stimulus on top of that.
Philip Cross, do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, very much so. And I think, too, what's really ironic about the recovery is that along with housing, the natural resource sector has been leading the recovery. That's the one sector that this government doesn't want anything to do with, hasn't done anything but put roadblocks in their way of growing. And yet the demand is so strong in these sectors that they've been leading the recovery. So it's really quite ironic the way the recovery has worked out.
Yeah, commodity prices have been really almost an issue. They've rebounded so much. Is that right, Philip?
Oh, very much so. That's a big part of it. That is the largest part of the increase in inflationary pressures, is the increase we've seen in oil prices, gasoline at the pump, but also across the board, we've seen strength in metals. Lumber earlier this year was completely out of control. As Aaron mentioned, the food agricultural sector has been strong. We haven't seen across the board strength like this in commodities since the peak of the super cycle back in the mid-2000s.
Very interesting stuff. We are going to pivot after the break to more election talk. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back here at Boom Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, at the News Forum here with Aaron Wudrick. He is the director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Domestic Policy Program, and also from MLI, Philip Cross, who is a senior fellow there. Okay, so now we acknowledge that we're in an election, and obviously that changes nothing or changes everything, depending upon your point of view, perhaps. Philip Cross, how does that change kind of your analysis of what's going on when it comes to spending by the government of Canada?
Well, what I've been watching in this election campaign, and I really find it quite distressing, is parties are revealing the mix. Everybody, I think, agrees that the deficit's going to have to come down. We can't have $354 billion deficits. Well, we probably couldn't afford it for 1 year, never mind longer. So everybody agrees the deficit's coming down. Parties have to reveal their preferences. Are we going to do this through cutting spending, or are we going to do it through higher taxes? It's quite interesting that most parties are talking about higher taxes. Most obviously the NDP, they're going to bring in a wealth tax, they're going to bring in corporate income taxes. It's the exact opposite of what economists recommend. When we had to deal with the fiscal crisis in the federal government in the mid-90s, over 80% of the deficit reduction was done through spending restraint. That's about what the IMF recommends. They say that somewhere between 80 and preferably even 100% spending restraint. You want to avoid tax hikes as much as possible, because tax hikes discourage investment, lead people to leave less money in the pockets of people. So as I say, we don't seem to have learned that lesson at all. In fact, we seem to be going in the exact opposite direction. More and more parties are talking about raising taxes. Almost nobody's talking about spending restraint. And that's the exact opposite of what economists want.
Yeah, Aaron Wudrick, obviously, whenever you have an election, parties are going to make promises. So that's not exactly, that's man bites dog kind of thing. It's gonna, that's what they want, to get the attention. So is that where we're in right now? A lot of promises that are more expensive?
Yeah, look, yeah, as you say, it's certainly not the first election where parties are going to try and bid for your vote by talking about how much they're going to spend. But what I think might be a little different in this case is the pandemic is providing cover for anything and everything in terms of spending. People can just point and say, oh, we had a pandemic, and therefore that justifies spending this and that. And I think there might be, a little bit of, people have been desensitized to the idea of a deficit. If you go back before the pandemic, talking about a $20 or $30 billion deficit seemed really big. Whereas now, if you're coming off $300 billion, suddenly 150 doesn't seem that large. And that's where I worry, is that parties are using this as cover to just sort of shrug off the idea that we can spend and not worry about how we're going to pay for it. And as Philip said, the real way you get this under control is to cut spending. Look, there's going to be different preferences in terms of size of government. Some people will want more spending and some will want less. But surely we can all agree you have to figure out a way to pay for it. And that's not what we're seeing with any of the party spending plans. Okay.
This is a little bit unfair because we only have one of the major parties who've got a full platform, and it is being costed as we speak. That's the Conservative Party of Canada and Aaron O'Toole's 160-page platform. Now, some of it is foreign policy. There's a bunch of stuff in terms of environmental policy, which I suppose is costly as well. But a lot of it is domestic policy. So that I'm going to give Aaron the first crack. I'm not expecting that you've read every one of those 160 pages to a T, but you've probably done what I did, which is at least flip through it and seen some things in it. So what really struck you when you read that platform?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's very detailed. I think they went out of their way to try and demonstrate that they put a lot of thought in some of these policies. I would say a lot of them are more interventionist than you might normally expect from a conservative party. If you think of conservative parties as the party of free markets, there is talk about unleashing innovation and things like that, but there is a fair bit of industrial policy in there that I don't think we've seen for some time. The platform is uncosted. I believe all of them are. I think the parliamentary budget officer is going to cost them. So to put some price tags on it, but I think it's defensible policy. It's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but it's a serious document that's got a lot of meat in it.
We've got just over 30 seconds. I'll get to Philip next round, but the one in the shop window, Aaron, in 30 seconds is the Gst Holiday in December. What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, it's a little bit gimmicky, but it's something that certainly gets people's attention. That's the time of year when people spend a lot of money, and so if you're looking for retail politics that is going to grab people's attention, it's probably not a bad start.
Well, we will continue our analysis after the break. Please stay with us. Philip Cross will be up to give him fair rights of rebuttal or at least analysis. Stay with us. We'll be back after these messages. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm Tony Clement, and we're here with Aaron Wudrick and Philip Cross, both at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute think tank. Philip, we were talking about specifically the platform of the Conservative Party of Canada just released just a few days ago. Any initial thoughts on what you saw in there or didn't see in there?
Well, I suppose the one encouraging thing I would say is that even if the GST tax cut is only 1 month and a bit gimmicky, as Aaron said, at least there's a recognition in there that we're not going to try to fix the deficit problems by raising taxes. Thank God for that. But the other side of it is there isn't really a serious attempt at reducing the deficit. It's spread out over 10 years. They're basically going to allow growth and let current spending programs unwind to deal with the problem. And that probably reflects, again, as Aaron said, that there really isn't a consensus in the country now that government has grown too large during the pandemic. There seems to be a lot of support for it. So I think campaigning on a platform where you target a lot of spending restraint probably wouldn't fly. So, until the country is right, we saw that with the Chrétien government in 94, 95. Their first budget wasn't very well received. It wasn't a serious attempt. But once they explained to Canadians the seriousness of the problem, in 95, it actually became quite popular. And actually, it was the IMF cited Canada in the mid-90s as an example of what they call expansionary austerity. Austerity doesn't have to be contractionary if it's done properly, if it's done more through spending cuts than tax hikes.
Yeah, and we'll get to Aaron in a second, but Philip, I agree with you on that. But this whole COVID umbrella under which we find ourselves now, people are just getting used to massive spending. I mean, are you concerned about that?
Oh, very much so. And I think it's quite probable that, that's going to continue until interest rates start rising. And when that happens, then all of a sudden, the gravy train is going to be over. The era of free money for governments and rates could start rising quite rapidly, particularly if inflationary pressures continue to accumulate. So very quickly, governments could find themselves in a quite difficult position where servicing these large deficits run up during the pandemic, the true cost of that will surface, and then people will have to realize the world didn't change during the pandemic. At the end of the day, we're going to have to make real choices about what we're going to spend on. We can't just spend on everything.
Yeah, Aaron Wudrick, I've had professors and other experts, commentators, economists on my show here, with talking about modern monetary theory. And, it kind of works until it doesn't, in my view. Like 1 minute you've got zero interest rate concerns. So sure, print more money, give it to the government. They'll spend the money, and there's no real hike in interest rates, so who cares? But at some point, gravity, Newtonian physics does apply. Is that what you're concerned about as well?
Yeah, it's a bit like Wile E. Coyote going over the edge of the cliff, right? He can keep running for a little while, but then eventually looks down and then there's trouble, right? So I think, the reality is for most Canadians under the age of 40, they don't remember a time of high interest rates and inflation out of control. I mean, when you can get a mortgage for 2%, people figure, why not just go for the big house? But if you get back into a world where people are paying 15, 20% on a mortgage, I think you're going to see a very different change in attitude pretty quick.
My first mortgage was 16.5%. So I remember those days. So maybe that's what it's going to take. And I say that without any pleasure, believe me, because it can be very painful. But are you seeing anything about Liberal policy pronouncements to date about where they're going to go on this? All I hear about is pivot. That seems to be the word. But I haven't, in 30 seconds, Aaron, anything come across your desk yet?
No, and it's interesting because the Democrats and Conservatives have released their full platforms. It's the Liberals that seem to have decided to leave, that they're going to drip stuff out. So we'll have to wait and see what's coming down the pipe.
Well, I guess that means we're going to have you gentlemen back, because we've got to have a full program and analyze the other parties as well. But thank you for being here for this very interesting discussion about stimulus spending and fiscal policy during the election period. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having us.
Very interesting discussion about stimulus, about money being spent by governments for people, and what the impact on the economy is. It's all fun and games until inflation starts, which it is doing, and until interest rates start to jack up, and then there possibly is a lot of pain caused by that. So we'll be watching this very closely. Obviously, we're in the throes of an election campaign as well, so political parties are starting to make their promises. We'll be analyzing that, but thanks for being here today.